The first gunshot split the dawn silence as Viola Montgomery clutched her crying baby to her chest and peered through the cracked window of her dilapidated homestead. 3 raiders, the same men who'd murdered her husband James last winter, were circling back, determined to claim the land she had nothing left to defend. Montana Territory, 1876. The unforgiving landscape that had once held so much promise now seemed like a cruel joke. At 23, Viola found herself a widow with 2 small children, dwindling supplies, and no way to make it through another harsh season. James had been dead 6 months, shot down while defending their small plot of land that bordered the coveted water access these raiders wanted for their cattle operation. "Mama, I'm scared," whispered 5-year-old Thomas, clinging to her skirt as another shot rang out, this one splintering the wooden post near their front door. "Hush now," Viola murmured, bouncing 7-month-old Emma in her arms. "Stay low and quiet." The baby's cries grew louder, her tiny face red with hunger. There was hardly anything left to eat, just a handful of beans and some dried meat that wouldn't last another day. Pride had kept Viola from seeking help sooner, but pride wouldn't feed her children. The pounding of hooves grew closer as the raiders approached. Viola knew they wouldn't kill her outright, that wasn't their way. They'd simply make life impossible until starvation drove her family out, or worse. "Mrs. Montgomery," a gruff voice called out. "You've had your time to consider our offer. $10 for the land is more than fair for a woman in your position." Viola didn't respond. $10 might as well have been nothing. The land was worth 20 times that, with its access to Stone Creek, the only reliable water source for miles. James had died protecting it, and she wouldn't dishonor his memory by surrendering it for a pittance. A third shot cracked through the air, this one taking out their rain barrel, their last source of clean water. Emma's wails grew louder, and Thomas began to cry too. Viola felt something inside her break. Not her resolve, but the last of her pride. That night, after the raiders had ridden off with promises to return, Viola knew she had to act. She packed what little they had left, a change of clothes for each of them, James's hunting knife, and their marriage certificate, and set out on foot toward the nearest town of Crestfall, 15 miles away. The journey was brutal. The summer heat beat down mercilessly as Viola carried Emma and held Thomas's hand, urging him forward when his little legs grew tired. By nightfall, they'd only covered 8 miles, and they had no choice but to make camp in a shallow ravine. "Mama, I'm hungry," Thomas whimpered as Viola gave him the last morsel of dried beef. "I know, sweet boy," she whispered, fighting back tears. "We'll find help soon." Morning brought no relief. Emma refused her mother's breast, which had long since dried up from Viola's own malnourishment. Thomas trudged silently beside her, his usual chatter replaced by exhausted silence. By midday, with the town still miles away, Viola spotted a lone rider approaching from the west. Her first instinct was to hide, but she had no strength left. If this was to be their end, so be it. She stood in the middle of the dusty trail, her children in her arms, and waited. The rider slowed his horse as he approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the sun. His clothes were dusty but well-kept, and the 6-shooter at his hip looked well-maintained. Not a raider, she thought with relief. Something about his steady gaze gave her hope. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat, "you look to be in some trouble." Viola fought the lump in her throat. "My children," she managed to say, her voice cracking. Emma had stopped crying hours ago, which frightened Viola more than her wails ever had. Thomas swayed on his feet beside her, the man dismounted in one fluid motion, his eyes taking in their condition with a grim expression. "My name's Quentin Jacks," he said, approaching slowly. "I was heading to Crestfall on business." "We haven't eaten in days," Viola admitted, the words tearing from her throat. She'd never begged for anything in her life, but her children's lives were worth more than her dignity. "Please." "We need help." Quentin reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen and some wrapped jerky. "Here," he said, handing them to her. Small sips for the little ones. Viola's hands trembled as she helped Thomas drink and moistened Emma's parched lips. The baby stirred, whimpering softly, the most beautiful sound Viola had ever heard. Raiders drove us from our home, she explained, accepting a piece of jerky for herself only after the children had eaten. My husband's been gone 6 months now, Quentin's jaw tightened. The Blackburn gang. Viola nodded, surprised. You know of them? I know they've been pushing folks off their land all across the territory, he said grimly. They've got no respect for the law or decent folk trying to make a life out here. He looked at the children, then back at Viola. You can't make it to town on foot, not in this condition. We have to try, Viola said, straightening her shoulders despite her exhaustion. Quentin studied her for a moment, respect flashing in his eyes. Madam, I'm offering to take you and your children to Crestfall. My horse can carry us all that far. Viola hesitated only briefly. Why would you help strangers? Because it's what decent folks do, he said simply. And because I've seen what happens when good people don't stand up to men like the Blackburns. As he helped her mount his horse, placing Thomas in front of her and carefully arranging Emma in her arms, Viola felt a crushing wave of gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. Quentin walked beside the horse, leading it carefully. No need for thanks, Mrs. Montgomery, she supplied. Viola Montgomery. No need for thanks, Mrs. Montgomery. Let's just get you and your little ones to safety. They reached Crestfall by evening, a small but growing town with a main street lined with wooden buildings. Quentin led them directly to the doctor's house at the edge of town. Dr. Wilson, a kind-faced older man, took one look at the family and ushered them inside. Malnutrition and dehydration, he diagnosed after examining the children. The baby's in a bad way, but children are resilient. A few days of proper care should see improvement. I can't pay you, Viola admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. We'll work something out, the doctor said kindly. My wife could use help with mending and such. Quentin remained in the doorway, his hat in his hands. I'll cover their expenses, Doc. Viola started to protest, but he shook his head. It's the least I can do. You get some rest, Mrs. Montgomery. I'll check in on you tomorrow. True to his word, Quentin returned the next morning with supplies, food, clean clothes for the children, and a small toy for Thomas. He visited again that evening and the next day and the day after that. As the children began to regain their strength, Viola learned more about their rescuer. Quentin Jacks was a former Texas Ranger who now worked as a horse trader and occasional bounty hunter. He was 31, unmarried, and had come to Montana to deliver a string of horses to a rancher outside of Crestfall. Why are you being so kind to us? Viola asked on the 5th evening as they sat on the doctor's porch. The children were asleep inside, their color finally returning to normal. Quentin was silent for a moment, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. I had a sister, he finally said. She married young, had 2 little ones. Her husband was killed in a dispute over water rights. She tried to make it on her own. His voice grew tight. No one helped her when she needed it most. Viola understood the rest without him saying it. I'm sorry, she whispered. That was 10 years ago, he said. I swore I'd never turn away from someone who needed help the way my sister did. 2 weeks later, with the children recovered, Viola faced a difficult decision. The doctor and his wife had been kind, but they couldn't stay indefinitely. Yet returning to their homestead with the Blackburn gang still terrorizing the area wasn't an option. I could find work in town, she mused one evening as she and Quentin walked along the edge of town. Perhaps at the hotel or the general store. And live where? Quentin asked practically. Lodgings in town aren't cheap, especially with 2 little ones. Viola sighed. He was right, of course. I don't know what to do, she admitted. I have nowhere to go, but I can't keep accepting charity. Quentin stopped walking and turned to face her. I have a proposition, Mrs. Montgomery. Viola, she corrected gently. After all they'd been through, formality seemed unnecessary. Viola, he amended with a small smile. I own a small ranch about 30 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy house, a barn, and enough land to run a modest herd. I've been away so much that I've hardly had time to work it properly. He cleared his throat. There's a small cabin on the property, separate from the main house. It was meant for a ranch hand, but I've never hired one. You and your children could stay there. In exchange, you could keep house and cook meals when I'm there. Viola stared at him, searching for ulterior motives but finding none in his earnest expression. That's very generous, but it would help me as much as you, he insisted. The place needs a woman's touch, and I'm away often enough that you'd have your privacy. It was a practical arrangement, one that would benefit them both. Still, Viola hesitated. What about the Blackburns? I can't just abandon our land to them. Quentin's expression hardened. The law is finally taking notice of the Blackburns. Marshal Davies in Helena has been gathering testimonies from displaced homesteaders. With enough evidence, they'll be brought to justice and your land will still be yours. Hope fluttered in Viola's chest. You really think so? I know so, Quentin said firmly. And in the meantime, you and your children will be safe. 3 days later, Viola found herself in a wagon beside Quentin, heading north with her children and the few possessions they'd acquired in town. The cabin turned out to be small but sound, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a small garden plot that had gone to seed but could be revived. It's not much, Quentin said apologetically as he helped her carry in the supplies he'd purchased in town. Viola looked around at the solid walls, the tight roof, the clean window panes. It's perfect, she said softly, meaning it. Life settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Viola cleaned and organized the cabin, planted vegetables in the garden, and cooked meals for Quentin when he wasn't away on business. Thomas followed Quentin around like a shadow whenever the man was home, soaking up attention and knowledge like a sponge. Even little Emma seemed to flourish, growing plumper and more active each day. Quentin was a quiet man, but his actions spoke volumes. He carved a small wooden horse for Thomas and fashioned a rattle for Emma. He never entered the cabin without knocking, always brought back something special from his trips to town, and taught Viola to shoot his spare revolver, just in case. Summer faded into autumn, and with the changing leaves came changing feelings. Viola caught herself watching Quentin as he worked with the horses or repaired the barn roof, admiring not just his kindness but the strong lines of his body and the rare smile that transformed his serious face. One evening, as they sat on the porch after the children were asleep, Quentin cleared his throat nervously. "I've been thinking," he began. A dangerous pastime, Viola teased, comfortable enough now to joke with him. He smiled briefly. "I've been called to Helena to testify against the Blackburns. Marshal Davies has gathered enough evidence for a trial." Viola's heart leapt. "That's wonderful news, it is," he agreed, "but I'll be gone for at least 2 weeks. I don't like the idea of leaving you and the children alone for so long." "We'll be fine," Viola assured him, though the thought of his absence created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. Quentin nodded, but he seemed unsettled. "There's something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I received word from the land office. The Blackburns never filed a claim on your property. It's still legally yours." Viola stared at him in shock as he placed the pouch in her hand. "The deed is in there, along with enough money to rebuild what they destroyed. Once the trial is over, you could go back if you wanted." The implication hung in the air between them. She could leave, return to the life she'd been building with James. It was what she should want. "I see," she said carefully, studying his face in the fading light. "And what do you want, Quentin?" He looked away, his profile strong against the darkening sky. "It doesn't matter what I want. You have choices now, and that's what counts." But it did matter. It mattered enormously, Viola realized. In the months since he'd found them on that dusty road, Quentin had become more than their rescuer. He'd become family. "It matters to me," she insisted, reaching out to touch his hand. Quentin turned to her, vulnerability clear in his eyes. "I want you to stay," he admitted quietly. All of you, but I won't hold you to an arrangement born of desperation. Viola's heart pounded. And if it's no longer desperation that keeps me here, hope flickered across his face. What are you saying, Viola? I'm saying that sometimes life gives us second chances we never expected, she said carefully. James will always be in my heart as the father of my children, but my heart isn't as closed as I thought it was. Quentin's hand turned over to clasp hers. I never thought I'd find someone who made me want to stay in one place, he said roughly. And then I found three someones all at once. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a question more than a declaration. When they pulled apart, Viola felt lighter than she had in years. I'll wait, Quentin promised. Go to Helena with me, see the Blackburns brought to justice, visit your land, take all the time you need to be sure. So they went to Helena, the four of them together. Viola testified about the harassment, the threats, the murder of her husband. The trial lasted 10 days, and justice was served. The Blackburn brothers were sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Afterward, they traveled to her old homestead. The cabin was damaged but not beyond repair. The land was still good, the creek still flowed. Memories of James were everywhere, in the oak tree he'd planted, in the rocking chair he'd built, in the wildflowers that grew where he was buried. Viola stood by his grave, Thomas and Emma beside her, and said a proper goodbye. You would want us to be happy, she whispered, to be safe and loved. I've found that again, James. I hope you can see it and understand. When they returned to Quentin's ranch, their ranch now, Viola had made her decision. As winter settled over the mountains, they made plans and promises. They would rebuild her homestead in the spring and lease it to a worthy family. They would expand Quentin's herd and hire proper help. They would build a life together. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling softly outside and the children asleep before the fire, Quentin knelt before Viola with a simple gold band. I know it hasn't been very long, he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. But when you know, you know. I love you, Viola Montgomery. I love Thomas and Emma as if they were my own. I want to build a life with all of you if you'll have me. Tears blurred Viola's vision as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. We'll have you. They were married on New Year's Day in the town church, with Dr. Wilson and his wife as witnesses and the children standing proudly beside them. The townspeople, who had come to know and respect both of them, filled the small church to capacity. I'll protect you forever, Quentin promised as they exchanged vows, echoing the words he'd said to her that day on the trail when she'd whispered for help. Spring brought new beginnings. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Thomas started school in town, riding proudly on his own pony beside Quentin. Emma took her first steps across the cabin floor, straight into Quentin's waiting arms. By summer, Viola was expecting their child, a new life created from their love and resilience. As her belly grew, so did their happiness and the prosperity of their ranch. On a warm September evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Quentin placed his hand on Viola's rounded stomach and felt their baby kick. I never thought I could be this happy, he admitted. When I found you on that trail, I was just doing what any decent man would do. Viola covered his hand with hers. You saved us, she said simply, not just from hunger and the elements, but from a life without hope. You saved me too, he replied. From loneliness, from wandering. You gave me a home and a family. Their son was born as the first snow fell, a strong, healthy boy they named Samuel James Jacks, honoring both the past and the future. As Quentin held his son for the first time, his eyes shining with tears of joy, Viola knew they had found something precious and rare. A second chance at happiness, built on mutual respect, genuine care, and deep, abiding love. 5 years passed, bringing both challenges and joys. The ranch prospered, growing to become one of the most successful in the territory. Thomas, now 10, was the spitting image of his biological father but had taken on Quentin's mannerisms and quiet strength. Emma, at 5, was a spirited girl with her mother's determination and beauty. And young Samuel, joined 2 years later by his sister Rose, completed their family circle. On the anniversary of the day Quentin had found them on that dusty trail, the family gathered for a special dinner. As Viola looked around the table at the faces of those she loved, her children healthy and happy, her husband's eyes still looking at her with the same devotion as always, she remembered the desperate woman she had been, whispering for help with her last breath of hope. "What are you thinking about?" Quentin asked softly, reaching for her hand across the table. Viola smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "I'm thinking about promises kept," she said, "and how love can find us in the most unexpected moments if we're brave enough to recognize it when it comes." Outside, the Montana sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, a fitting backdrop to a love story that had begun in desperation, but flourished into something beautiful and enduring, as vast and promising as the western frontier itself.